Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute promoting a free and virtuous society. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/podcasts. If you have a comment or an idea for a future episode, you can email us at podcast@acton.org. Acton Line is available to stream on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and acton.org.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, Librarian and Research Associate at the Acton Institute. Today I'm joined by Jenna Robinson. Jenna is president of the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal. She also serves on the board of the Alumni Free Speech Alliance, the UNC Alumni Free Speech Alliance, the steering committee of the Bastiat Society of Raleigh, and is a member of the Board of Visitors at UNC Chapel Hill. Jenna, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
It's great to be here this morning.
So we have had maybe, since Alan Bloom's Closing of the American Mind, we've had sort of like a crisis in American education. That at different times, in different ways, people have felt this, but it's really universal now. Everybody from anywhere on the political spectrum, from administrators to faculty to students to parents, everybody has issues with higher education today. How do you see what's the nature of that crisis in education? Because there's a lot of, people talk about it in terms of rising costs sometimes. People talk about it in terms of, lowering of standards. There's all sorts of things that people are concerned about. How do you see it?
Right. Well, how long do you have?
We have the whole episode. So.
Excellent. So they're really, all of the pieces that you mentioned are all part of the same crisis. And I think they all have the same root. And the same root is that too many people are turning to the four-year degree as a catch-all, be-all solution for their formation, their job prospects, for everything. Too many people are going to college. And if you follow the incentives, which is something that I like to do, that started with federal money. So if you go all the way back to the GI Bill, you see the federal government just flooding higher education with money. And then they followed that up in the 70s with the Pell Grants and with student loans. And student loans are really the big, the big one. That's where most of the money is coming from. And so if you look at what happens downstream of federal money, you get colleges beginning to not just accept students, but recruit students, regardless of whether they want to be there, regardless of whether they're ready to be there, regardless of whether they've really thought about what they want to get out of college. You also get universities increasing their tuition. That's the Bennett hypothesis, right? You have federal money is available, and universities, in their pursuit of their mission, which is anything and everything, will continue to try to capture that money. So there you get our tuition crisis. Mm-hmm. And they also will start to lower standards in order to get more and more and more students. And so all of it is really related. And I think it's coming to a head now for a couple of reasons. But almost every piece of the crisis is related to another piece. You can't think of them in isolation.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up, this kind of goes back to the GI Bill. I like to say, so my grandfather was a naval aviator in the Second World War. He lived to be 102 years old, just passed away this past year. But he went to Michigan State University after he got out of the Navy. Mm-hmm. And he was educated in a one-room schoolhouse in Holt, Michigan. And I like to say that when my grandfather got into Michigan State is when Russell Kirk started thinking he needed to get out of Michigan State.
Right. It was growing.
Yeah. And I've heard this, you see this in Kirk's writings, but then you also, like my grandfather when he got there, they were literally constructing barracks for all of the men that were enrolling. They did not have housing for them. But it was just a mad rush for students. And Kirk saw that from the angle of faculty.
Right.
And you have these young men, like many of them did, many heroic things during the war, but that didn't prepare them for the rigors of the academy. Mm-hmm. So the curriculum had to change. The university had to change. And underlying all of that was the federal money that made that possible. Intention's very noble, but it fundamentally changed the nature of the university system in America.
It did.
Now, what are the reasons behind why the federal government is interested, why state governments are interested in education? Is colleges and universities think a lot about education in terms of preparing students for work and career. And they see this as a way of raising the human capital of the population. And they think, okay, if we put more students in through this factory on the one end, we get an educated workforce that is more competitive, that sort of thing. Is that true, I guess, is one part of the question. And the other part of the question is how much should universities think about their work in terms of work and career preparedness? Because students are definitely thinking about it. Parents, probably more than anybody, are thinking about it when they're making these investments in their children's education.
Right.
Is that how it should be?
So it is still true, even today, with all the problems in higher education, that students on average who graduate from college with a 4-year degree make more and get a positive ROI than if they never went. Now, there are a lot of assumptions baked into that statement. One is what is the value add that college is doing, and what is just the signaling aspect that colleges are choosing students who are already prepared, who are already gritty, who are already willing to take on certain challenges, follow certain rules, in order to, prepare themselves for the workplace. And that's the argument that Brian Kaplan makes, that, it's all just signaling. Colleges are really good at picking people who are gritty and are rule followers and are going to make good employees. They find them, they house them for 4 years, they teach them something that mostly students don't remember, and then they spit them out ready for the workforce. And so I think that that's what a lot of students want. If you ask students, why are you going to college? Most of them will tell you something career related. It'll be, to get a better job, because the job I want requires a degree, because I want to make more money, because I want to provide for my family. You'll get variations on that theme. They'll also say eventually because they want to learn something. But they're there for the return on investment. And with college as expensive as it is today, I get it. You can't afford to spend, $300,000 for something that's going to make you worse off. It has to be something that's going to give you a return. That said, I'm somewhat in sympathy with Kaplan's argument that a lot of this is just signaling, because the students who choose to go to college are different from the students who don't choose to go to college in significant and important ways. And so I think we should be not just assuming that, no matter what colleges do, we're going to get this effect. I think colleges do need to pay more attention to what they're doing once students get there, and not just treating it like job preparation, especially in this moment we're in now, where there's so much flux in the economy, so much flux in future jobs because of AI. Just because the rapid pace of innovation, it's always been true that we don't know exactly what the jobs of the future will look like, but I think it's especially true right now. And so universities need to think about that carefully. Are we preparing students for jobs that don't even exist? Yeah.
And one of the things, that wage premium exists, but it's something that we're starting to see fade.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still there. It's still very real, but it's less pronounced than it used to be. And Kaplan points out that wage premium largely disappears if you don't finish college.
Absolutely.
And there are many students that enroll in college that, due to life circumstances, due to a lack of preparedness, due to financial difficulties, family situations, don't complete their degrees. And that money really doesn't pay off in those cases in the way that it does when someone finishes a degree program.
Yeah, absolutely. And only about 60% of students finish these days, and that's within 6 or 8 years. The number that finish within 4 years is much lower.
Yeah, and that's something to be very concerned about. So people have thought about college as a productivity engine, as something to prepare people for the workforce. People have also thought about college, and this goes back to John Dewey and a lot of the early education reformers, both in this country and in Europe, thought about education as something to form citizens, that this is something, including higher education, this is something that's still baked into the DNA and talked about explicitly a lot in K through 12 education in a lot of state standards. In colleges and universities, it's a little different. How do you see that role in college and universities in terms of the formation of citizens? If the career preparedness is kind of hit and miss, are we at least getting a good return on these institutional investments in terms of getting well-formed citizens?
I think there is a growing awareness at colleges and universities that this is something they should be paying more attention to, especially after we've seen so many protests. College leaders are waking up to the fact that students don't know how to talk to each other. They don't know how to persuade each other. And these are the very people who are going to be our future leaders. So I think it's even more important in colleges and universities to prepare citizens, because many people who graduate from college won't be just citizens. They will be our elected officials. They will be our top bureaucrats. They will be our CEOs and our philanthropic leaders. And so making sure that those people have an idea of what it means to be a citizen, not just, get out the vote, but to be truly engaged, to understand your community's needs, your community's foundations, what it means to be an American that is, different than being a European or a citizen of somewhere else in the world. I think that it is especially important for universities to take on that role. But right now, they're really not. A lot of universities aren't even requiring that students take an American history course or a civics course. And I sometimes hear people say, well, they took that in high school. But we all know that high school has been dumbed down in a lot of cases. Students aren't reading primary documents for the most part in high school. They aren't doing a deep dive in understanding, why was our system set up the way it was? Why do we have federalism here in our country, which is really different from other places? Why do we have checks and balances? Why do we have free speech? They might know that free speech is in the First Amendment, but they haven't talked about the why. They don't have that deeper understanding. And I think the role of universities is to make sure that students do have that understanding.
Yeah. So the career preparedness, we're not getting great marks there. We're not getting great marks on preparing students as citizens. Another thing that universities have traditionally done, at least actually throughout the world, in the Western world and beyond, is they've served as places where cultural traditions, traditional wisdom is handed down from one generation to the next. That sort of Republic of Letters is one way we could talk about it. A more early modern way to talk about it is introducing people to this sort of like great civilizational conversation that we're all enriched by. How are American universities handling that?
So I think this is one where there is a handful of universities doing an amazing job at that. They're mostly small religious institutions. Yeah. But for the most part, our large secular public institutions are not doing a very good job. We have general education curricula that is, cafeteria style. You take a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Colleges are pretty indifferent as to what you take as long as you do so within the prescribed categories. Taking a history of the United States is equivalent to taking, the history of, fashion. They treat them the same. And, the same story goes across the requirements. Do you want to take Shakespeare? Do you want to take modern beat poetry? We are indifferent as a college. And so the tradition is not being passed on. There have been studies, the American Council of Trustees and Alumni a while back found that a lot of English departments aren't requiring their majors to take Shakespeare, which is just unbelievable to me. And we know it was in the headlines a few years ago that classics departments in various universities are now no longer requiring Greek and Latin. And that is something that 200 years ago was a staple of higher education. It was the prerequisite to get into a lot of our institutions of higher education, is you had to be able to read, Thucydides in the original language. And so higher education is really unrecognizable from parts of our tradition, except in these rare places where they are still doing it.
So when you mentioned those places, you talked about a lot of these are primarily religious institutions, and at the font of sort of human culture. I mean, we get the word culture itself from cultus, from cults, from religion. How is religion faring on America's campuses? Both, I mean, you have these religious institutions, but the vast majority of American students go to public universities and colleges. The vast majority of religious students in America go to school at public universities and colleges. How is if higher ed is failing to hand down Shakespeare in America, how are they doing with the country's religious heritage?
They are completely ignoring it.
Yeah.
I think is the nicest answer. If you go through a typical curriculum, you won't hear almost anything about religion unless you hear maybe about the Reformation as just a one piece of history. But in general, you will hear very little about religion. You'll hear nothing about religion's importance in the foundations of our country and its traditions. And if you are in a religion class, you will probably hear negative things about religion. That is the state of the religious studies departments in most places these days. There are some bright spots. There is a consortium of Christian study centers, and these study centers exist at universities across the country, both public universities and secular private institutions, and I think they're doing a great job. They are giving students the additional information about our religious traditions, and also, a place for Christian students to gather on campus that is missing. But universities themselves I think that they have bought into this idea that we have to have a wall of separation between church and state, which of course doesn't appear anywhere in our legal documents. It comes from a letter. And so they think that the best way to do that is, not to mention our religious history and to accept real, ignorance of our religious traditions. I think a lot of students probably, don't know really much about our religious heritage at all.
I think that's very fair. There are a lot of religious folks. The churches are struggling with this transmission as well. So it's really a sort of multidimensional problem. There are a couple of structural issues in higher ed. And you hear this from different groups of people. You have some folks, particularly faculty, I hear from, is they will hear this story that you've been unpacking about the tragedy of American higher education, and faculty often will blame administrators or governance of universities. And they say, if university faculties were actually running the show, we wouldn't have all these problems. And it's because of administrative bloat, those sorts of governance issues within universities. A concentration of power among college presidents is another common theme you hear in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education, where a lot of these university faculty get together and discuss these issues. What's your perspective on those sort of governance issues with universities, and how do they contribute to this constellation of problems?
Right. Well, I'll start with administrative bloat. That is absolutely 100% a problem, and it contributes significantly to the high cost of higher education. Over the past, 25, 50 years, the administration has grown far, far, far faster than the faculty. Administrative salaries have grown faster than faculty salaries. We've switched from a majority of tenure or tenure track faculty to either a majority or a plurality of adjunct faculty or fixed term faculty. And so administration is absolutely the cost driver, which is a big part of our current crisis in higher education. It just costs too much. But I can't give faculty a pass on, what students are actually learning, because aside from pretty broad strokes, faculty are the ones who are driving the curricula. If you look within a department at what's being taught, faculty are the ones creating the courses. Faculty are the ones often chasing novelty. And, that I don't blame on any individual faculty member, because we have this publish or perish mentality. You have to publish something new or you don't get ahead. But faculty are the ones in charge of how you decide who gets tenure. So they have created the system that says you have to publish to get tenure. And so I think, faculty have contributed to a lot of these problems. I'll talk about general education specifically. So faculty committees create the general education curriculum at any particular institution. Sometimes you have, particular people who volunteered to be on the committee, but it is always some kind of faculty committee, and they get together, and there is a lot of, there are turf wars, there's log rolling, and you get something that looks, unrecognizable as a general education. But that is a direct result of faculty governance that's kind of based on this, this consensus and this unwillingness to make hard decisions. Because what I've noticed is you get faculty in a committee, and they're unwilling to say that any one discipline is more important than any other discipline. Even within their discipline, they're unwilling to say that Shakespeare is more important than the beat poets. And so you end up with a curriculum that is meaningless or fluffy, or a waste of time, as a lot of students will say it is. They're checking boxes to get through it so that they can get to their major classes that they actually care about. And I think that has been an abdication of faculty responsibility to create something worth teaching. They have essentially said, we have no opinions about what it is that is most important for students to learn. And I think that's a tragedy.
With all respect to Allen Ginsberg, I saw the greatest minds of my generation locked in interminable faculty meetings about these sorts of things. What you've outlined here is that faculty also have a responsibility for the state of governance. One of the other common criticisms of faculty you'll hear, particularly from ordinary average Americans that are center right to right wing folks, going back, William F. Buckley was talking about this in the early 50s, that there is a pervasive left wing bias in the American academy. What do you make of those sorts of concerns? How do they contribute to this overall, all these problems we've outlined?
Right. So it has always been true, going back to Buckley, that faculty have on average skewed more liberal or more progressive than the average American citizen. And I don't think it was really a problem for a lot of that time, because you still had a critical mass of conservatives or libertarians or people in the middle, moderates, who were on the faculty and who were contributing. But I do think that we have now gotten to the point that it is very hard to find someone who identifies as a Republican or a conservative in a lot of faculty departments. So if you look at anthropology, sociology, English, law, you get very, very few Republicans or conservatives. And I think that does start to create, a groupthink, where if you don't have any dissenting voices, or you only have, one conservative in your whole department, there will be questions that don't get asked. There will be assumptions that are baked into the education that faculty don't even realize are assumptions. One that I noticed in political science is the assumption that government ought to be the first place we look for solving society's problems. And I think a lot of political science scholars didn't even realize that was an assumption. And I think it occurs because there are so few conservatives who might say, well, no, we should look to civil society, we should look to religion, we should look to family. Government shouldn't be our first place we go to solve problems. And so I do think that now it's damaging the disciplines now that there's so much homogeneity of thought. So we really do need to think about that a lot and ways to solve that problem. But I think even worse than the lopsidedness of faculty are students, because although students are more politically mixed, they are often the most outspoken ones, are the ones on the far left. They're the ones who are willing to shout people down. And so a lot of students, especially students on the right, are afraid to speak up. We see that all the time. If you look at surveys, the biggest problem is self-censorship. And that self-censorship is because of what my peers will think. The Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression does surveys about this, and they find it over and over that students are somewhat worried about what faculty will say or whether faculty will give them a bad grade. But they are far more worried about peers who will ostracize them, people who won't date them. My social life will be in the toilet. And so adding all of this up, you get a very homogenous, a culture that's just very hostile to ideas and conversations.
There are a number of really great, and I want to stress at this point, you're absolutely right that in terms of raw numbers, where America's faculty lines up politically. But there are some incredibly sort of heroic conservative and libertarian academics who are doing great work in the constraints of that system and pushing back against a lot of this stuff. One of them, Harvey Mansfield at Harvard, long illustrious tenure at Harvard, actually gets into one of the things I wanted to talk about next when he talked about at Harvard, even in America's elite education institutions, there's a lot of pressure on faculty to reduce standards and with great inflation. Oh, yeah. And it got so bad that Harvey Mansfield, and this was pressure from the administration, from students, he started giving 2 grades. He would give the actual what's on the report card grade, which he referred to as the ironic grade. And then there was his actual evaluation of the student's performance in the course, which was feedback for them because he felt professionally obligated as a professor to actually give students real feedback as to how he thought they mastered the material. How is this tied? I could see this tying in several different ways, but how do you think through this sort of great inflation and lowering of standards beyond the question of like what's on the curriculum, but just the basic, just the basic failure of a lot of colleges to fail students when they don't master material?
Well, I mean, this goes back to colleges' insatiable desire for enrollment.
Yep.
They want enrollment, so they lower the standards for admission to get people in, regardless of whether they're really prepared. And then once they've gotten them there, they realize, we have to change what we're teaching and we have to grade differently. Otherwise, we'll flunk too many students and then we'll lose those enrollments. And so it goes back to the chase for enrollment, and it goes all the way back to the GI Bill. Russell Kirk writes in Academic Renewal in the Higher Learning that this started. He saw it starting after the GI Bill, that the standards had to be reduced, not because GIs are uniquely unprepared, but because if you're admitting people en masse without any kind of admissions requirements, grade requirements, SATs, anything like that, then inevitably you're going to get a lot of students who are not ready to be there.
When I was at Calvin College, I got actually a teaching certificate at Calvin College, and there was a great education professor there at the time, Leroy Stedjink, who was an amazing professor. He also served here on the board of Grand Rapids Public Schools. He was an elected official there, taught high school, taught at the university level. And when he looked into when this started happening at Calvin, it ended up coinciding very closely with the Vietnam War. And what happened is the Fs disappeared because faculty members were reluctant to fail students out of college where they may become draft eligible and thus basically get sent to Southeast Asia and be put into a situation of great peril. And it's interesting, that's like just a microcosm of one university when that happened. But it literally, that was the jump. And it was literally like during that mid-60s to mid-70s, there's a jump of a grade level. Of the average student at Calvin was a C student when this started, which makes sense because a C is an average grade. And then it jumps up to a B. And then he pointed out, had risen ever since.
Yes.
You like to think that's because you're recruiting better students, but there's a lot of different pressures at play, as you've pointed out. We have been talking about problems a lot in this interview so far. And the James G. Martin Center for Academic Renewal is actually in the business of academic renewal and solutions and addressing these problems. Where is a good place to start? When you've got such a multidimensional set of problems with expectations of students and parents, problems with faculty, problems with administrators, problems with government, like nobody's hands are clean in this, and there's a lot to fix.
Yeah.
Where should we start thinking about cultivating renewal?
So one thing that has been very encouraging lately is that Congress has taken up this issue, and they've taken it up, the root cause, which is the too much money in higher education. And so they've stated that if students can't get a job that makes, X much more than a high school graduate, then those programs will not be eligible for student loans. And I think that's a really good start. I would have liked to see skin in the game where colleges actually had to repay part of defaulted loans. But this is good. This is a very good start that Congress is now cognizant of the problem, is addressing the problem. They also got rid of some of the loans that are just the exorbitant amounts that graduate students could borrow and that parents could borrow through the Parent Plus program. And so just getting some of the excess money out, I think, will help. I think another place at the federal level that's very promising is reforming accreditation. Because accreditation, as you know, is our accreditors are the gatekeepers for federal money. And right now, they are all very uniform. For a long time, we had this regional accreditation system where if you were in the Southeast, you had to be accredited by SACS. If you were in the Northeast, you had to be accredited by that accreditor, et cetera. It was all just based on where you were located. And, that made sense a long time ago when you had to travel to a university in order to figure out what they were doing. But that's just not the world we live in anymore. So during the first Trump administration, Betsy DeVos deregulated the accreditors and said, you can now choose an accreditor outside of your region. Any of the federal accreditors will do. And now the second Trump administration has been saying, we're going to make it easier for new accreditors to come along and hopefully shake the system up so that we aren't having all accreditors look exactly the same.
What are some of these things that this is something that's opaque to a lot of parents, a lot of students. Faculty is familiar with this. Yes. Administrators are very familiar with this. But the general public is less familiar with, they might have some knowledge of, I want to go to an accredited college versus an unaccredited college, but they don't actually know what goes into that accreditation. What are the sort of things that these accreditors look at when they're handing out accreditation?
Right. So they're looking at financial management, which is, I think, the one thing that they do that is somewhat helpful. But their general pattern has been that they detect problems far too late. So there's one small HBCU in my home state of North Carolina. It has been troubled for 30 years, and accreditors didn't start, chastising them for that, trying to get them to fix things until much later into this imminent financial failure. But they do. That is something that they look at very closely is finance. My opinion is that they look at it too late, and that they also only have really one maneuver. You are, well, maybe it's two. You're either, accredited or not, and in the interim, you can be, under advisory or so. I can't remember what it's called.
Yeah.
But they don't have a really good plan for rehabilitating colleges that are having financial difficulties. So it's really the death penalty if you lose accreditation, right? Because that's the end of federal funding. But the other things that they're looking into, we think of accreditation, well, it should be consumer protection. It should be making sure that there's some kind of academic quality. And it's really not any of that, because what they're looking at is inputs.
Okay.
And it's reams of data. I've heard stories from faculty saying, well, they were asking about office space for faculty members. How much office space do individual faculty members have? What is the student-teacher ratio? How much money is spent on various things? And so it is all inputs rather than outputs. And you can have all the right inputs, but if your students aren't learning and if they aren't getting jobs, then that's not really proving to American citizens, to parents and students that college is doing anything worthwhile. And so at least one of the new accreditors that is on the horizon, the Post-Secondary Commission, it proposes to look at outcomes. It specifically proposes to look at economic mobility. How good a job are colleges doing in taking a student who is low income and then giving them the human capital to go and get a job that's going to pay them well? I don't think that's a model that we should apply to all of our colleges, but I love that it is an option for some colleges to say, you know what, that's our mission. Our mission is economic mobility. We want to serve low-income students. We are all about ROI. We're all about job preparation. And so that's the accreditor that we're going to choose so that we can then show our value in providing economic mobility. And so I'm very hopeful that we get more accreditors that are looking at outcomes, that are looking at different kinds of outcomes, and that we get a real flowering of innovation and kind of diversity, not of students, but of diversity of institutions, so that students can really pick an institution that fits them best, and that those institutions can pick an accreditor that fits them best, because they should all have unique missions. We shouldn't have, this one college mission statement that is then, replicated 4,000 times. Yeah. That's boring. And it doesn't serve our economy. It doesn't serve us as individuals trying to seek wisdom. It doesn't serve us in so many ways. So I'm hopeful about that. And I'm also hopeful about states realizing that, most students in our state go to public colleges, and we really can make a difference. We see these new schools of civic thought that are cropping up, mostly at public institutions. I think that's a very promising new innovation. We see a lot of states, red states especially, but a lot of states looking at general education, realizing we need to end this cafeteria-style general education and start insisting that students learn something real. Arkansas recently revised their general education, and I think it's a step in the right direction. Utah recently adopted new legislation, somewhat based on a bill by the Martin Center and the National Association of Scholars and EPPC, it's called the General Education Act, and they improved their general education based on Western history, Western civilization, and civics. And so we are seeing an increased awareness of the problem and also solutions.
So this general education reform, this has been something that a lot of people have been talking about for a very long time. You have the whole University of Chicago was created, in fact, to do this sort of thing. Columbia has a great books program. We have had E.D. Hirsch in sort of the K through 12 space talk about core knowledge curriculum.
Right.
And we've got National Heritage Academies, which started locally here. I did some student aiding there in my teacher training. And it was literally in the back of the teacher's books, they were like a list of concepts that you would want to check the box that these students had learned over the years. And for folks not familiar, in the education world, education standards, like they might be called education standards, but they're pretty loose most of the time.
Right.
It's not actually concrete things like students should be able to name and identify the 50 states and their capitals. Like that's a very concrete, you can test a kid, either he knows that where Arkansas is, what it looks like, and that its capital is Little Rock, or not. That is something that a lot of university faculty are going to resist because they have a great deal of autonomy in what they teach and that sort of thing. What has your experience been? What are the kind of things that you're trying to do with general education reform? And what is the reception you've seen from all of the various stakeholders in education? Because it's a very, there were these, there have been small scale wars fought over curriculum.
Oh yes, no,
in the United States for a long time.
That is still true. Faculty are most faculty are resistant. I've met several faculty members who say this is great. We need to do this.
Yeah.
But that's not the majority. The majority, I would say, are resistant for two reasons. The first is that, as you said, faculty autonomy. They see any curriculum that isn't created by the faculty as a non-starter. Faculty must create the curriculum. It must be organic, coming up from the faculty. But secondly, a lot of them are hostile to the Western tradition, are hostile to civics. And so we saw in North Carolina when there was a bill to teach civics in colleges and universities and do so to a high standard, saying you have to read primary documents, you have to be tested on these documents. There were faculty members who, signed a petition saying that, they didn't like the content. And so, yes, faculty are very resistant for the most part. There are exceptions, as I said. But I think that faculty developed general education curricula have been a failure. And I think that the incentives for creating a general education curriculum in the organic faculty-led way that they want to do, the incentives are terrible. Departments want enrollments, and so their incentive is to offer courses that are going to be the most sexy-looking courses for students to take. And so you get courses on Taylor Swift instead of on something more substantive. And so, and you also get, as I said, faculty members in one department will approve courses from another department so that they can get their courses approved. And so the whole process is just, fraught with these incentives that make it terrible, and which is why you get general education curricula with 2,000 options. And so I think that we've tried. We really have tried the faculty-led model. It's been a disaster. And we need to try something different. And what we argued in our general education model legislation is that decisions about what it is important to learn are not a matter of expertise, which is what the faculty really have. They have expertise within their disciplines, deep expertise. But deciding it is important to learn America's traditions, that's not a matter of expertise. That's a value judgment. And that's a value judgment about the purpose of higher education. And for public institutions, that purpose has to be decided by representatives of the people, as best as they can. And so I think it is appropriate for trustees or legislatures to create general education curricula. And in fact, that is something that's gone back a long way. We have, in the 1920s, we have examples of General Assemblies saying there must be civics instruction, or this is what general education is going to look like. And even more recently, Florida and Texas have always had their general education determined by legislation. And so it's nothing new to say that this is not the general education. The determinant of what every single student will take is not going to be a faculty-led process. That's going to be something that's determined at a different level of governance.
Mm-hmm. So when we talk about, it seems like this is turning off the money spigot is part of it. It's just there's just too much money in higher education. We need to pull some of that back. But it seems like the second major part of this is a curriculum issue. What is the sort of curriculum? Like, what does somebody who's going to graduate with a college degree in America, what sort of things should they be taking? And how long should they be taking them? Because, there are only so many hours in the day. There's only so many hours in the school year. And, it's a very worrisome trend, in fact, that some people are taking 5, 6, 7 years to finish college. We actually want a model where, people are actually beginning their professional lives in their early 20s and not in their late 20s, because that affects family formation, that affects lifetime earnings, that affects, this education is for life. It's not an end in itself. Everybody coming into higher education in the United States has had at least 12 years already of education. They shouldn't have to sign up for more than 4 more. How do you balance all that?
Right. It is very hard. And so as part of the process of creating our General Education Act, we had a lot of discussions about what should be in and what should not. And, how do we fit this all into 40 hours? Yeah. Because 40 hours is really the maximum. A lot of states are saying, we really need to fit gen ed in 30 because the majors are taking up so many student credit hours. And so I think most of the disciplines are not going to be surprising about what students should learn. They should learn civics. They should learn American history. They should learn, a broader Western history. They should also be learning, literary classics, both from the American tradition and the Western tradition. They should be learning philosophy, some Greek philosophy, some of the Plato, Aristotle, some of the things on which our country is based. One of the more controversial decisions that we've made, and we've gotten more pushback on this than anything else, is we ended up eliminating foreign language from the requirements because the view that we all came to was that right now a lot of gen ed curricula require 2 years, 2 semesters, something paltry in foreign language. You cannot actually learn a foreign language in that little time. And so, we made the hard decision that, look, if you're not going to actually make a person into a speaker of a different language, then this is just wasting time. You're learning to say, hello, my name is, in a different language. It's very elementary, and that's not where we want to be spending our time. But, students should also have basic mathematic understanding, whether that's, probability and statistics, which would be my preference in the age that we're living in. That's what most people are actually going to need for understanding, the news. Or, basic algebraic understanding. And then we also need natural sciences. And the importance, the emphasis, I don't think, should be on any particular natural science. It should be understanding the scientific process, understanding the value of objective criteria, of iterative processes to discover the truth. How do we use the scientific process to pursue truth? And so, as I said, none of these are surprising. These are what you would have seen in a general education curriculum in, say, the 1950s.
So one of the things, when you talk about 40 hours seems low to me. This is partially because, I went to Hillsdale College. I don't think there was a class I took in my first 2 years, which was probably around 60 credit hours.
Yeah.
That wasn't a gen ed requirement. including 2 semesters of foreign language. I tested out of one of them, but that was there. It can get you into trouble, though. I once corresponded with somebody, responded to a German academic in German because his query I could understand, and I was like, just write it back. And then ever since, he's written me in German, and I don't have the heart to tell him, like, I don't know that well. Most of the time, I have to put this through Google Translate now. But so, I think you're right about. I think one of the things that can give, particularly because of the way that language knowledge works, and that if you're not using it day in, day out, you will not retain it. I mean, that's just a fact of life. Any minister in this country that took any Hebrew and Greek in seminary, 30 years out of seminary, like, they might remember some things, some key words, some etymologies they learned. But even somebody who has a consistent professional engagement with a foreign language, if they're not actually speaking, writing, reading in it, communicating in it on a day-to-day basis, it fades. Is 40 a place to start? Because this is the problem. I mean, politics is the art of the possible.
Yes.
And education and academic renewal is the art of the possible. And I don't want to get bogged down into what is my pie in the sky perfect education, because whatever that is, there's not enough students to fill up that college or university that would be in the market for that. But there are ways we can improve on the margins. So when you talk about civics, when you talk about American history, when you talk about Western history, when you talk about literature, that's sort of just trying to raise the bar up to this level. Civics and American history, I understand. Literature and Western history, I understand. But there's one of the classic sort of curriculum wars in the 90s was about Western civilization's role in American education. And I kind of see it from both ways, because I took 2 history surveys when I went through as a senior in high school. I took at Calvin College here locally, they had a history of West and the world, 1 and 2. And it was actually a history of both the West and the world. I learned about the Tang Dynasty. We read Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, in addition to Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness.
Right.
At Hillsdale, I got none of that. I got an excellent education at Hillsdale. I got an excellent education in, their standard survey courses at that time, and I think still is Western Heritage, American Heritage, first semester, second semester, history. But I think you lose something there when you don't have, because what we're both want to teach students where they're from, but we also want to teach them something about the world that they're in now.
Right.
And the reality of the world we're in now is that we have an re-emerging Chinese and Indian civilizations now. We have an African continent that is exploding in population, in productivity. New things are happening in non-Western parts of the world. How did you think through that when you were thinking about these questions?
Right. So I think part of it, we've thought about it from the sense that, well, they first need to learn about, where they come from, the world we are in, the world they're living in. And so we started with that Western history, Western civilization, because America is a product of that. And so they need to know that first. But we also thought of, this emerging trend in China, the emerging trends in the economy. These are all modern phenomena. And I think the modern phenomena, I think, mostly belong within the disciplines. And so if you're a political science student, you should learn about, the current politics of, global politics.
Yeah.
And if you're if you are a history student, then you can start doing that more global history. If you're an English major, which now does, comparative literature, you can do that within your major. And so there are a lot of opportunities within majors to get the specific information you need about the world we live in now, the global economy that we live in now, as a business major maybe. that I think is more appropriate than trying to go back and learn about, say, the Tang Dynasty.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions I wanted to ask is, this is something that got brought up very early in our conversation, but it hasn't come up since, but I think is going to loom very large in education in the future, is the role of AI. Part of it is it's a way to deliver instruction in a new way. It's a way for faculty to engage in research in new and in very constructive, powerful ways. It's also a way for students to cheat. And this is something every academic I talk to now, anyone who teaches anywhere, from state universities to small Christian liberal arts colleges, deals with this. And universally, they're struggling to deal with it. What is your thinking on AI and the future of education? There's definite downside to it. We're seeing that now. I think there's upside potential, but I don't think we've realized that on the scale we've realized the downside of you dealing with the faculty dealing with AI-generated papers for their students. That is pervasive now, today.
Right. Definitely, I think the downside came first because it's so simple to get AI to write something for you. And I think that, to me, that begs a larger question. Why do students have AI create their papers? Because they don't see the value in doing it themselves. And so I do think that this is a moment where we need to be teaching students, the point of you being here is not to get a diploma at the end. The point of you being here is to learn something. And if you use AI to write your paper, you are actually completely devaluing what you are purportedly here for. And I think we also need to, stop at the beginning of every course and tell students, why it's important to learn this material. Why maybe it's important to love this material. And I think we've gotten away from that in this very instrumental view of education. And so that's my first reaction to the widespread use of AI. Your students don't know why they're in college. Let's remind them so that they will realize that they're cheating themselves if they're using AI, because they're not going to learn. But I do see a big upside for AI. There was a recent paper written by two Harvard professors, physicists, and they had developed a model for AI tutoring in physics. And they compared it to a large survey course on physics. And they did pre and post. They did experimental modeling. It was very good, very well-written experiment, well-designed experiment. And they showed that students retained more when they were taught by the AI tutor than when they took the survey course in physics. And this was specifically about learning how to do specific mechanics problems in physics. And they explained why they think that is. The AI tutor is infinitely patient. The AI tutor is one-on-one, which you don't get in a big physics lecture course. There is no fear from the students to tell the AI tutor, stop, I didn't understand that, do it again. Whereas in a big physics class, you are not going to raise your hand, in front of 400 other people and say, wait, I didn't understand. Can you do that again? Nobody does that, right? And so there are very good reasons to think that there are particular tasks in higher education that well-designed AI can do better than we're doing with current constraints. Current constraints meaning, we can't possibly have one-on-one in every course. And so I do think AI has immense potential. I think it also has potential to make the administration of higher education more affordable, because it can do these big data tasks that are all being done behind the scenes by, army of staff that in the future we can have AI take on some of those things, like the bursar's office and the admissions office doing, collating all these data points. And so I do think there's an upside, but you're absolutely right. We are seeing the downside first.
Yeah. What are the things at the Martin Center that you're doing right now? You've talked about some of your past work you've done on general education. What are some of the things coming up that you're planning for, that you're excited about in the future? Now, you do a lot of policy work in North Carolina in particular. You are yourself a product of North Carolina University system,
Right.
Which is a wonderful system. What is the Martin Center going to do in the future in North Carolina? And then what are you thinking about in terms of American higher education writ large?
So we are absolutely going to continue on general education because I really do see it as the key to so many things. I see it as the key not only to making students have a better education, but really to saving the humanities and the liberal arts, which is something we didn't talk about. These departments and these disciplines are dwindling.
Yeah.
And so I think a big part of keeping those as a central focus in higher education is putting them back into general education. So that will continue to be a huge focus for us. As we approach America's semi-quincentennial, one thing we're going to be doing is looking at across all the 50 states, what does civics education look like? Which university systems requirement? What do those requirements look like? Is it required in college? Are students having to take a civics test? We think that's extremely important as we approach the semi-quincentennial. And we're also, one of my colleagues is going to write a paper coming up in the next year about what does teaching for virtue look like in specific civic virtue, because we are seeing this renewal in civics education. And so in a secular pluralistic institution, how do you teach for civic virtue or other types of virtue, which is something that people are trying to do, is very important, but is hard in our pluralistic society.
Jenna, thank you so much for being with us on Action Line. We'll continue to follow the excellent work of the Martin Center, and thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
It was great to be here. Thanks.
Thank you for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Acton or hear more of this podcast, please visit acton.org/podcasts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.